I want to start with the psalm, which is one of the favorites. It's Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." I hope you noticed that the hymn before the gospel was a paraphrase of it, or at least some of the themes in it. Psalm 23 is one of those psalms that people know so well that when a new translation of the Bible comes out, people react against it if it doesn't have a familiar cadence or rhythm or vocabulary. It may surprise you that there are translations of this that say things like, "Though I walk through the valley of deep darkness, I shall fear no harm." Or, Or, "My cup is full and is spilling over," which has a different image than, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil," or "My cup is running over." There's a story when our current prayer book came out that the initial translation of Psalm 23 ended up saying something along the lines of, "My cup is full and is spilling." And the faithful Episcopalians, who never get riled up about anything except liturgical things or anything changing in their church ever, had a revolt, and we got "My cup is running over," which is in line with the King James translation. And it might surprise you how much of our English Bibles trace their paths intentionally back to the King James. And it might, if you know that, it might surprise you a little more that the King James very heavily relied on making sure people who spoke or read, which was probably more important from that crowd, Latin, that the King James was generally in line with the Vulgate, which was a 4th, 5th century translation of the scriptures into Latin. Hold on to this idea of translations and things that make you comfortable, or translations that make you comfortable, or that you've known so long that it could not possibly be other. The passage from 1 Samuel is the beginning of the adventures of who will become King David. And if you know your scriptures up to this point, it is not surprising that the youngest is chosen. If you just read this out of context, it's very surprising, right? You would assume, if you know a little bit of history, that the oldest is always the best. And the youngest is always the one that's going to, be the youngest forever. But if you go back, you will discover that pretty much every single one of the stories leading up to this in the Bible follow a pattern, and I'll lay it out for you so you can see it. Adam and Eve, and then you've got Cain and Abel, and then Seth is the one that the line comes out of. And then you have Abraham and his oldest half-son, well, his full son, but Isaac is the second-born. Esau, and Isaac, the line comes out of Isaac. Esau is born before Jacob, so Jacob is the younger one. Joseph, the famous one, right? Joseph that goes down to Egypt, whose day is today. St. Joseph's Day. It's actually St. Joseph as in the New Testament one. But today is St. Joseph's Day. Joseph is the youngest. There's that whole story about a dream coat that's Technicolor and what have you. And then Moses. You might not know this. Did you know Moses' older brother is Aaron? Right? Lots of younger. So by the time we get to David, if you know the biblical history, and the Pharisees who are featured in our gospel today would probably have known this, it is not remotely surprising that the younger one is chosen by God. Now, on a human level, normally, and the story is told in such a way that a king, a future king who's going to supplant Saul, who's described as a foot taller than everybody else and this great warrior, if Samuel's going to pick a king that's going to supplant Saul, it seems quite unlikely that he would take the youngest and smallest of the group. But that's what he does. And the point of this and many of those stories is that God does not follow the patterns and the assumptions that all of us always have. That the biggest, the strongest, the oldest is necessarily the best. And of course, we often expand that from just the biggest, the strongest, the best. We turn the best into those who look like us and come from our areas and speak our languages and believe the same things as we do must equal the best. That's not how God works. Now we get into the gospel passage today, which I think is fairly obvious that it's a mix of two things. It is a healing, and a miraculous one at that, of a man who is blind and given sight. But buried not too far below the surface is this entire conversation that the Pharisees and the religious leaders are not just spiritually blind. They don't see God at work around them. I mean, if you think about it for a second, there's some humor, sadly, in this whole back and forth of even his parents get dragged in. Well, he was blind, and he sees now, but you got us. Who knows where that came from? Ask him. He's old enough. He's going to know. The whole scene is kind of absurd. Like his neighbors, well, that's him. Nah, it just looks exactly like him. There's this willfulness and this idea, but it's not, the top level is the sort of absurdity of the story in the sense that people don't see what's right before them, right? Which of course is the whole point. But it goes deeper into this idea that people often don't see God right before them. And a question that you could ask, and I would argue you probably should, is why? Why is it that the Pharisees and the religious leaders in this story can't even get around the fact, I mean, they start pulling things out. Well, it's the Sabbath, so maybe that's, they can't get around the fact that right in front of them something has happened and God is present. I would make an argument that we are all very Pharisaical, every single one of us, more often than we want to admit. I think what's going on in this passage is that the Pharisees are so wrapped up in their own assumptions about how the world must work, their own assumptions about how God and the world that God has created and the people that God has created must fall into certain categories, that they are blind to God actually working around them. And we do this all the time. All the time. We do this because we want God to be in our image rather than the other way around. If you know Genesis, God is not created in our image. We are created in the image of God. It's from the first chapter of Genesis. And it is very good. And we build into our churches. We build into our faith traditions. We build into our societies things that support the idea that God is in our image rather than the other way around. Now, sometimes it's comically ridiculous, and it really doesn't make any difference. So the example I gave you of Psalm 23. People get all wrapped up if you use a different translation of Psalm 23. If we happened to use another translation that said, though I walk through the deepest, darkest valley, I shall fear no danger, I'd have 15 people emailing me after church saying, I can't believe you changed the Bible. If I changed out the Lord's Prayer and used a more modern translation or a Presbyterian translation that says, instead of trespasses, debtors, Or the other one that's in our prayer book, instead of trespasses, sins. Again, I'd have a whole bunch of people. And it would be framed in, why are you upsetting us? We've always done it this way. Maybe we do know that there are other translations, but we've always done it this way. Which is interesting from a church perspective. It means you can't ever change anything, because if you do, you run afoul of we've always done it this way. Well, sometimes we've always done it this way is just dead wrong. Now, I'll give you an example, and one that is incredibly problematic, because it is an example that has been going on for about 1,500 years, and people attach it not just to the Bible and Christianity, but they attach it also to how God works and how Christians think. None of you, well, maybe this is not true. Most of you have never read the Song of Songs. Who's read the Song of Songs? I'm going to guess like 5 or 6 people in the room. Okay, at least one, couple. The Song of Songs is the most unbiblical book in the Bible. And I mean that literally. It's a love song between a man and a woman. It's actually a woman and a man, because it starts from the woman's perspective. And I'm not sure God is mentioned at all. And there's great fights with the rabbis about whether the Song of Songs should even be in the scriptures. But it's in there. The opening frame of the Song of Songs is the woman, and it's a love song. She's talking about how much she loves this man, and it goes back and forth. And she says, in the NRSV, which is the New Revised Standard Version, which we read in church, she says, in I think it's verse 5, chapter 1, I am black, and I am beautiful, as the tents of Kedar. Now, if you know some of the background, the tents of Kedar, their ancestors are the Bedouins that still wander around Israel and places like that. And since the dawn of time to this day, they have been making tents in the wilderness and living there. This is probably where Israeli ancestors that we're reading about in Samuel were living in places like this. Since the dawn of time, they've been living in tents that have as their covering black goat skin, jet black goat skin, covering the top. And if you're ever in Israel and you see these things, it's actually really stunningly beautiful in this landscape of nothing and sand and rock and these black places that stand out. And it says loudly, people are here. It's pretty awesome. Now that's the reference that she's giving. I am black and I am beautiful as the tents of Kedar. Now that's in the New Revised Standard Version. Every single English translation published almost ever before 1990, every single one has a slightly different translation. Anybody know it? I am black, but I am beautiful. That is drastically different. I am black and I am beautiful. I am black, but I am beautiful. There are other translations which have drifted even into other territory. I am weathered, and yet I am fair. Notice there's still an and yet. Where does this come from? How can you translate something that says on the one hand, I am black and I am beautiful, which is equated with I am excellent, or I am black but I am beautiful, which says there's a problem with me? Well, I said earlier that most of our translations go back to the King James. And in this case, it is mostly true that the translation that most of these English versions seek to mirror so people in the pews don't get upset is the King James, which says, I am black, but I am beautiful. But the problem goes back quite a bit further. And if you ever hear somebody say, Well, back in Roman times, slavery was different than it was in, 150 years ago. They didn't have racial-related slavery. Well, it's interesting that this problem in the text goes back to the Latin version, which translates a Greek text and or a Hebrew text, which both unambiguously say, I am black and I am beautiful, into the Latin to unambiguously say, I am black, but I am beautiful. This is a 1,500-year-old problem. And it is a problem that has taken root in so many ways that if you open up your Bible and read this love song in English or in Latin for the last 1,500 years, you will be left with an impression that people that are black are but beautiful as opposed to and, which is terrible. Terrible. Do you get what I'm talking about? So, all of this is to say, I started off by saying that the Pharisees were like all of us, that we like to create God in our image. And you can see how a translation in English and in Latin, which is generally Northern and European, has managed, despite the fact most of us never even knew about it, to perpetuate a translation that says people that look like us are more in the image of God than those that might not look like us. The scriptures are the other way around. We are made in the image of God. There are many different colors and backgrounds and languages and traditions and lands and customs and anything you can throw a stick at or shake a stick at. People are made in the image of God. And if you remember the book of Genesis, it was not just good. It was very good. It was excellent. It was great. I hope, as you continue your faith journey as a Christian, that you question things that have just been passed unto you. Often they are right, but they are not always right. Sometimes there are comical traditions that we do. I have a great story about this. A friend of mine, these are traditions that don't matter, and they are funny, and yet we still do them. A friend of mine was doing supply priest at a church. When you're a supply priest, I've done this a couple of times, but you're sort of walked through the service and the liturgy and the customs and that sort of thing, so you don't upset the congregation. And he was told on the way in, there's a radiator in the back down there. He was told on the way in, as you walk in, the priest must touch the radiator and continue the procession up. And he said, why on earth are you touching the radiator? And they said, I don't know. I do not know. We don't know. And he asked, nobody knew. Nobody knew why. So he did not touch the radiator. And when he got up to the altar and he touched something up there, he got a giant static electrical shock. And he understood why they touched the radiator there. And he did it ever after. Oh, that doesn't matter. That we do it that way. You know, we say the psalm. You could go either way on the psalm. But there are some things that have been handed down to us which are worth questioning. And if you blindly accept everything that you are told, you actually end up looking a lot like a Pharisee who simply goes around saying, this is the way it has been. I've been living in my personal echo chamber my entire life as my ancestors have lived, and nothing must change. And when you do that, you can often end up with God literally in front of you, and you're on the wrong end of things, saying, well, maybe it was someone else. Maybe it's not God. So I encourage you, read your scriptures, ask questions, and as we like to think about ourselves, dig deeper. If you've read the Bible once, I got bad news for you. You probably read the wrong translation. Read it again. And after you've read it, read it in another translation and go from there. And remember that the most important thing that the Bible will say from its start is a complete rejection of the idea that God is made in our image, and rather that we are made in God's image. Different everything in the image of God, and it is very, very, very good. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.